The French Alps have wonderful landscapes that reveal the tectonic processes of how mountains are formed. But the geology the Alps contain tell older stories of when these rocks lay deep underwater, forming parts of rifted continental margins. The high Alps are winter playgrounds for skiers, but in summer, the rocks are available for geological investigation. So we can head into the hills to investigate not so much the story of mountain building, but to explore the geology of the precursor rifted continental margins and the former ocean basins.
So I've come to the ski resort of Montgenevre. Obviously in summer they keep the ski lifts working for mountain biking, and we're going up onto an area, well, a mountain called Chenaillet. It's a geo-trail and allows us to investigate an ancient continent-ocean transition zone. We'll take this lift and then we'll take another one, and it'll take us right up to 2,500 meters above sea level. Okay, time to get comfortable for the first lift. Well, that's one lift down. We're going to walk a few hundred meters down to the other lift to take us to the top. So let's get going. So, climbing up towards the top station of the Sommet des Anges, this is the Gondran lift. This landscape, twice over, was a World War II battlefield. So while we're taking the geological trail through here, we're going to have to be quite careful not to trip up over old nests of barbed wire, and some of the outcrops lie right next to old gun emplacements. Doesn't look like it on a fantastic day like today. So we're just almost at the top now. Our route after that is going to take us over the skyline and up the hill behind me, and that is the hill of Chenaillet itself. Okay, time to put the camera away and get ready to get off shortly. So our little tour is going to take us along this ridge line here. The really famous stuff is in that rugged ground beyond the col, and we're going to start off though in some really spectacular rocks just down by those little trees down there. Some of those funny shapes are old gun emplacements. Anyway, let's go and continue along, see what we find. So I've come to some rocks called the Gondran series, and they include these red materials, which are chert. This is Regularian chert, so deep water. Come up here, and the succession passes up into carbonates. These are also deep water carbonates, and they're now marlinite. So if you look down on the fabric in here, there's this really intense stretch delineation, which is trending more or less west-northwest. So sheared deep water rocks. Now we're going to walk down around the corner here, and have a look at a really spectacular section. And there's also an explanatory notice board put out by the Geo-trail. So this is an entrance to old gun emplacement. So these are the Kalkmarlenites. They're actually latest Jurassic in age, which was a time of abundant carbonate production, at least in this region of Tethys. And ahead of me are the red rocks, which are the cherts. And unfortunately, the old explanatory notice board has seen better days. That's a bit of a pity, because it used to be really neat. Anyway, what it's talking about is this stuff, which are the cherts, but they've also got all sorts of strange material in here, particularly in the shade, of course. And these are bits of serpentinite. So this is an example of a rock called ophicalcite, and it's a transitional rock between sedimentary and former mantle.
So putting this stratigraphic succession together, we have Jurassic limestones and cherts on rocks derived from serpentinized mantle. This succession once lay right out on a distal continental margin, now seen through a veil of intense alpine deformation.
And that's the first part of our story of the continent-ocean transition. Right, well, let's leave the ophicalcite behind. Lots of chert in here. Actually, the succession of carbonates, ophicalcite and chert are interleaved. There's part of that intense deformation we saw picked up by the magmatic fabric. And there's some really spectacular outcrops of the carbonate with peelites just around this corner. Really worth a look. So we're back into these grey, highly deformed carbonates, and they're really great stuff. Well, look at this. So our highly sheared carbonates here are interbedded with these slightly green peelites, and the peelites pick up some really spectacular extensional crenulation cleavage, and it relates to the overall deformation in here. These outcrops are more or less parallel to the stretching lineation that we saw up on the top. So it's an ideal orientation for thinking about the shear sense recorded by these strongly deformed rocks. So let's go back to look at the carbonate, and we can see it's got veins in it that are asymmetrically sheared, and they imply this shear sense, which is top to the west-northwest. So what about the extensional crenulation cleavage? How does this work? Well, we can see that as the peelites and the surrounding carbonates boudinage and thin away, the angle of the extensional crenulation cleavage with respect to the main bedding fabric in here decreases. So we can relate the extension of the overall multilayer to the thinning of the package as a whole and the back rotation of the extensional crenulation cleavage. Shear sense, top to the west-northwest. These are some of the best examples of extensional crenulation cleavage I know anywhere. So let's just look at some of that extension where the layer comes down, thins, and comes out again. So the overall shear that this represents is down and through the rock. So the shear zone is moving this way, and panels of shear are coming down through it, rather like large-scale shear bands within the overall shear zone. So even though this is a thrust sense shear zone, we think thrusting out towards the west-northwest, these low angle down to the west-northwest shears are associated with that overall transport. Really spectacular.
This deformation relates to Alpine tectonics and mountain building processes. But to keep track of the geology on our travels, let's build up a simple cross-section on this sketch topographic profile. So we can start by adding these Gondran series rocks.
Right, well, this area is something of a sculpture park for structural geology. We're going to leave here now, head out into the sunshine, and there's one more enigmatic outcrop and a slightly enigmatic stratigraphic unit before we wander up that hillside opposite. So you can see what I mean about a structural sculpture park. Spectacular little fold structure here in cut turbidites. Slightly enigmatic stratigraphic unit. We'll put that together later. But this is a really great place while we're walking past to see how cleavage is developed preferentially in politic units over the more competent, and you can see a really nice refraction as it comes through. Come in and have a closer look. So you can just about pick out the cleavage here, coming down in the coarse layer, and as you come up into here, it's got a lower angle with respect to bedding. So the cleavage refracts from the incompetent to the competent unit. There's also a really nice example of outer arc extension picked out by those veins, whereas the core of the fold in here has this much more intense cleavage that's more or less axial planar to the fold. Okay, well, enough of this. Let's get on to the main event over there on that rugged ridge.
So this has been a snapshot of the Gondran series. We can locate these strata on this old and simplified idea of the former continental margin that has since been squashed up into the Alps. Here deposited on the very distal continental margin. So, adding to our profile, we have Gondran turbidites, presumably overridden by something that promoted all that deformation. To see what lies structurally on top, we need to keep walking.
So it's time now to leave those sedimentary, metasedimentary rocks of the Gondran series behind. From here on in, we're dealing with igneous geology. So this is an old customs house. We're really quite close to the Italian border. And we've come here to start the transect up Chenaillet with those rather unprepossessing black rocks that are really scruffy down in the bottom there. They may be scruffy, but they're really important. So this black stuff, very streaky, it's the pentonite, hydrated mantle rocks. You mustn't tread on it. So there's quite a lot of this crumbly black serpentinite down here, but it's not all black. Some of it's white. This stuff, really surprising, and so we're getting complex straight away. This is stuff called plagiogranite. It's the superfractionated top of a basic magma body. Start off with sort of a basaltic gabbroic composition, and the last few percent of fractionate make material like this. So this is part of seafloor geology, even though it's essentially a granite, and it tells us that we've got a magma chamber placed into the mantle, because this is also surrounded by mantle rocks. So let's continue up the trail now. It's going to get quite busy because it's a popular trail. Let's see what we find as we go on up. Lots and lots of serpentinite here. It's really quite nice textures in some of these blocks. So, up through the serpentinite, but here, as the notice board tells me, we're into something different. These are gabbros, and as the notice board tells me, this is the moho. So, these are gabbros, and this is the mantle. Lump of serpentinite, clearly very different. So that's the contact. It's actually, of course, the edge of a magma chamber. And if I look closely, I can see that it's sheared. There's foliation against the contact. So not only is this moho an intrusive contact, it's also a sheared intrusive contact. Well, of course, shear zones in ocean settings are receiving quite a lot of research attention. But unfortunately, they're also received the attention of some pretty unscrupulous geologists who wreck outcrops like this with drilling right in the Geoparc, right on the nature trail. There are mountainsides available out here to find these contacts, and they go and do this. It's really unethical. It's rather like nicking birds' eggs or taking chunks out of monuments like Stonehenge or Notre Dame. We really can't be doing this as a science. Okay, rant over. Let's continue on up the trail. Quite a lot of gabbro. So it's not all gabbro up here. There are also these dolerite sheets. They come through like this. There's another one up here. It's rather cute. It's coming across subhorizontally, really cross-cutting the gabbro textures. So perhaps dolerites like this fed submarine basaltic lava flows. If so, let's better hope that this oceanic crust is thinner than normal, or we're in for a long walk. But while we're down in the gabbro still, or broadly the gabbro zone, there's a really important little outcrop just over here. And this is it. So, pretty clear dolerite coming through. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So let's first look at the gabbro. Some really nice coarse gabbroic texture. But if we look in detail, they're these patches which are essentially xenoliths of gabbro within gabbro. And the key part about these xenoliths that are slightly disrupted is they've got a really intense shape fabric. Now, igneous geologists tend to call these flazer gabbro. And in that term, we're hiding a lot of really important information, because this fabric tells us that this material, the gabbro, has deformed after it's fully crystallized, and this alignment of feldspar and these ferromag minerals basically are in intense high temperature crystal plastic deformation of the gabbro. Now, we're in the Alps. Intense deformation should be expected, and indeed we saw back on the Moho that the gabbro contact with the serpentinite was sheared. This is key information here because it tells us that we have intense high temperature deformation as part of the magmatic history, as part of the seafloor geology. It's nothing to do with the Alps. So what about the dolerite? Well, look at its contact. Okay, clearly cross-cutting the gabbro fabrics, but all the way along it is this green pasty material. This is epidote, and it tells of hydrothermal alteration along the contact between the dolerite and the gabbro. And that's going to be the next part of our story. So I'm going to continue on up the trail. Well, I'm almost out of the gabbro, and indeed almost out of the entire intrusive story for this part of the section, because as these notice boards are about to tell me, I'm about to encounter ocean floor basalts. Pillow lavas. Some really classic pillows. You wouldn't even think we're in the Alps. They're completely undeformed. Really nice bulbous patterns. You can work out from their shape they're right way up, as indeed has our section been from the mantle through the crust to the volcanic cover, the eruptive basalts erupted onto the seabed. And if we didn't walk through anything like 6 kilometers, we've only come up probably 200 meters, maybe 3 of gabbro. So a very thin section here of crust. And perhaps the reason for that we can see, we look at some outcrops just down here. So let's just leave those pillow lavas behind up there, come down back here, back down into the gabbro, because there's some really good sheared gabbro in here, and another cross-cutting relationship we can use to establish the shear zone was submarine. Well, it's a bit of a scramble down here, but it's worth it to find some really spectacular sheared gabbro. And this is the boulder I've come to find. It's really neat because there's an intense shear fabric and it's cross-cut by these epidosite veins. Epidosite is a seafloor hydrothermal group of minerals. This is the sort of root source plumbing system for a submarine exhalative hydrothermal system, a black smoker. So that tells us again that the gabbro has sheared while this was part of the seafloor geology, not the Alpine geology. So we have shear zones that are disrupting what you might think of as the normal type of oceanic crust. But actually it's not that normal at all. We're going to now head on over the top of Chenaillet. It's a bit of a walk. We're going to leave the gabbro and the intrusive geology behind and walk up through basalts and basalt debris. We're going to continue up and over the other side and look at the contact between the extrusive rocks and what lies below. You're in for a big surprise.
We can add what we've found on the walk up from the serpentinites at the old customs cabin onto our profile. Hydrated mantle, a couple of 100 meters of gabbro with a few dolerites, and then a lot of basalt, all the way to the summit. A very thin oceanic type crust. So now let's get to the top of the hill for a well-earned panoramic view.
So up at the summit of the Chenaillet, great view of Rochebrune at 3,350 odd meters above sea level, and then coming around here, the hills of the Briançonnet, and then keep coming round. Those are the Écrins, with the very high peak, the Bar des Écrins, and then the hill with the snowy glacier coming down off its summit is Pelvoux. So a great viewpoint here on the Chenaillet for the setting of this geology we've just been walking up. So let's just sit down over here and talk about that. So here I am sat on submarine lavas. This ground around here down to that little lake, that's all part of this seafloor geology, and it sits structurally as a really high level in Alpine geology because the white hill in the background, a thing called Chabaton, lies structurally underneath all this, and this has been emplaced onto that geology over there, which is the world of carbonates. So quite an interesting Alpine tectonic setting. But we're going to stay with the seafloor geology here and go down the other side of this hill, down past the ruins of the wartime emplacements up here, follow the crowds down to another contact. So let's head off down. So come over the top of Chenaillet. Our target are the rocks on that col, particularly that dark grey stripe, because due to late faulting we get to see mantle rocks again. So let's continue on down the path. It's well worth the trek. Okay, well, we're back on these black rocks, back on serpentinite, back on altered hydrated mantle. Let's look at these outcrops up here for some of the great textures they show. So sheared mantle rocks with carbonate filling in the bits between. Lots of veins. This is a fault rock. It's a breccia, some fresh mantle, some hydrated mantle. This is what ophicalcite looks like. So rocks very similar to this have been dredged from the floor at the Atlantic, and they're representative of ocean floor detachments, fault zones that expose mantle rocks. And here's that surface. Here it's in outcrop. So black, sheared serpentinite, and this is the detachment surface. It's a detachment unconformity because sat on top are brecciated pillow lavas. They're hyaloclastite. The brecciation is part of the seafloor geology. It's not fault rock. It's where the lava tubes have collapsed and fallen down, and they banked against the detachment surface. So an ocean floor detachment. This outcrop is what makes the Chenaillet area so fantastic. You have to get in a submersible going to the Atlantic to find this sort of thing otherwise.
And now we can build up the rest of our geological section. The Gondran series overlaid, overthrust, by a seafloor section from Mantle up to basaltic lava flows. Faults then bring in the mantle rocks, the serpentinite, to outcrop again, where they're overlain directly by basaltic debris. So these are the surfaces that are detachment faults that moved as this continental margin and the new oceanic crust formed, preserved now in the Alps, so we can observe them directly. And we could put this all together in a model explanation. Continental margin on the right, moving off into fledgling oceanic geology. Basic magma intruded into exhumed mantle, exhumed by faulting as the lithosphere stretched open. Then, much later, Alpine thrusting has telescoped all this together. This walk across Chenaillet is world famous for this geology.
So, a great walk. And we've culminated here at the ocean floor detachment. But actually, there's one more fantastic outcrop here we can see. It's just a bit of a diversion along the trail. So we'll just do that before heading back down to the valley. Well, I don't know what the collective noun for pillow lavas are, but surely this is where we should use it. Great piles of pillow lavas. Now, there's some nice outcrops here we can just get close to. If you've not seen pillow lavas before, well, we can get the way up from their geometry. So come over here and have a look. What we can see here are bulbous edges to pillows. These represent tops, and we know at the top because this one here has sagged down and comes in. So it's bulbous on top, cuspate underneath, and we can see the bulbous top of this one too. In the outcrop here, you can see that he's a pretty tube-like, running in and out like this. So pillow lavas are actually tubes. They're not really pillows like you might have on your bed. Anyway, really spectacular pillows, some of the best you'll find anywhere here. We're going to follow them down a bit and we'll see another great section through some pillows. So that's Italy, but we're going to stay in France and go down this hillside. Well, it sure is a whole lot of pillows. So pillows don't really get any more spectacular than this. Again, you can see the cuspate shape, bowed on that side, pinched in on this. They're young that way, and they're tipped up on end. Really spectacular. But unfortunately, we have to end this tour yet again on another example of really moronic behaviour. Look at this. So what sort of entitled behaviour means that a geologist goes and drills these holes on some of the most spectacular, photogenic and accessible pillow lavas you'll find anywhere? Totally outrageous. It's the sort of thing that brings our science into disrepute. Well, that more or less brings to an end our traverse across Chenaillet mountain. We're just going to walk back now across these nice alpine hummocky terrains back to the ski lift and back down to the valley bottom. It's been a really spectacular tour. Okay, time to get a bobble back down the valley. So one of the good things about that walk is you've got to be down by 4:30 to catch the last bubble back into the valley, which gives you plenty of time for a beer before dinner. Cheers.